in response to Philadelphia School District teachers' wish that they had a curriculum to teach climate change, and they're feeling that they weren't necessarily qualified to teach climate change, even in science classrooms. We pivoted in the past summer, 2020, to develop all remote engagements. And Tsemone and Connor are going to tell you a little bit about what we developed together.
So you'll see at the bottom left of the screen, scissor is a method that we came up with to help people tell their climate stories with just concrete steps. So we have in English, scissor, which stands for setting, impact, sense, and reflect. And in our Spanish language workshops, we have a different acronym that stands for similar things called listos. So we do cuentos listos de clima.
We also created a playlist for the crisis, which you can see in the bottom right corner, and it's something that you're going to hear later in this workshop as you write your own climate stories. And songs have been added to by people who've participated in our workshops. And we worked on a collaboration in the past a few months ago with Doublespeak, which is a translation magazine at Penn, to develop climate stories in translation. So people submitted climate stories in multiple languages.
We now have 15 languages for kind of do-it-yourself stories, as well as the 2 Spanish and English language sets of workshops that we have. Since we started last summer really developing all remote engagements, we also have made a video, a 12-minute video about the project. It's designed really to invite new people into the climate storytelling project, both teachers as well as students. We hope that you will feel yourself invited. We're going to give you just a flavor of what that documentary is like with a 1-minute clip.
It was November. I just grabbed the big jacket and I go out and I'm loading groceries into people's cars and it's hot. One of the customers mentions that, oh, it's such nice weather out. It is nice outside, but it is November and it should not be 75 degrees. Is no one else concerned about this issue? I decided, well, I have agency. I'm living, I'm breathing. I can do something about it. People like to think that climate change is an impending, unending natural phenomenon that you as an individual can't have an impact on. People need to realize that they too can be that act of change, that instant of change. You have agency, you can change your surroundings, you can change your surroundings. There's this idea that in 50 years, everything will fall apart, everything will be ruined. 50 years is 3 times my lifetime, and I like to think I've accomplished a good amount of things in my lifetime. The more young people we recruit, the better the future will be overall.
We also have a public story bank online. It's a growing repository of searchable climate stories that are sorted according to metadata tags that you can choose at the time when you submit your climate stories, such as too hot, too cold, wacky weather. You can see some of the others on the side here.
So there are many things that are currently in development. As I mentioned, we're working on new things now and eager really to hear your feedback towards the end of this workshop, to hear from you about ways you think that we could push this project together to make it more responsive to needs that you see and have. But concretely, what we're working on now is a workshop to train teachers to use this project in their classrooms. And we're going to give you a sample of what that type of workshop in your classroom might look like in just a moment. We're working on an illustrated workbook, which should be published later this month at the very end of August. And we have just received a grant to work intensively over a 2-year period with 10 classrooms across the city of Philadelphia to develop climate classrooms with media partners at our city's newspaper of record, the Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as our PBS affiliate, to really amplify and boost those stories. So now, with no further ado, we're gonna move over to a workshop which we call My Climate Story 101. This is a workshop which we would be delighted if you thought might be of use in your classroom, and we'll hear more from you on that topic toward the end. It's quite interactive, so really get your thinking caps on and don't be afraid to unmute and share in the chat. Tsemone is going to start asking you some questions.
So we always begin My Climate Story 101 by making sure everyone in the room is clear on the difference between weather and climate. And so I'd just like to ask you to type in the chat or just unmute yourself and speak, because I won't be able to see everyone with how my screen is set up right now. So feel free to unmute yourself and speak and just say what the difference between weather and climate is, or what weather is, or what climate is. So I see some responses in the chat, but weather is day to day, climate is patterns over time. Yeah, a bunch of people saying similar things. And yes, that's what we have too. Weather is kind of what you see when you look outside. Climate is the collection of those patterns over time. So good that everyone's on the same page. So why do we care about climate? Here are some statistics that we always share during My Climate Story 101 as well. There's been a 2-degree Fahrenheit rise in global temperature since 1880. Sea level has risen 1.5 feet in New Jersey since 1911. And people are 4 times more likely to experience an extreme hydrological event than in 1980s. These are some of the reasons why we care about these things.
So numbers aren't the only way to measure climate change. Humans, plants, and creatures can also tell us about how the climate is changing. One story may seem small, but if we look at lots of stories, we can start to see themes and trends that can become evidence in conversations and research about our changing world. Kind of like we take lots of measurements of temperature to come up with those larger temperature trends. So climate stories can also become a productive way to think about the emotional and social impacts of climate change. Emotions are a piece of each climate story, a personal link that enables us to connect our own everyday experiences with a greater store of data and scientific information about climate change. Our feelings, we say, and what we care about make quantitative data meaningful. So it's more than a tale of numbers, like parts per million, degrees, centimeters. It's also a tale of your senses, what you're experiencing and how you're feeling. Next slide, please.
Okay, let's talk climate. We're transitioning into a more active portion of our workshop, and in a few minutes, we're actually going to put you all into breakout rooms for a pre-writing activity. But first, we want to make sure that you're really, really clear on what a climate story is and how to write one. First, I'd like to introduce you to the scissor storytelling method. Actually, I think Connor will tell you about it. Connor developed this method.
Yeah, so the scissor storytelling framework asks people to think of a place, that setting, impact, that, so how has this place changed because of the changing global climate? It asks you to think of a sense, how you, sorry, I'm gonna mute myself. It asks how
I'll
you
jump.
sensed the change, so smelling, seeing, hearing, touching, and then how the change has impacted you personally, how the change felt, or even how it feels to think about these changes.
So what we would like for you to do now is to use the scissor method, or with that framework in your mind. We're going to ask you to go into breakout rooms of 2. Molly will soon put you there. And Molly will also broadcast to all the breakout rooms the scissor guidelines. So you'll have a handout to kind of work together with. And we're really asking you to interview one another, essentially, really doing that pre-writing exercise of exploring, well, what might my own climate story be? I find it's most helpful to really think about a place I care greatly about. And I think about it over time. How has this place changed? And then I think about my senses. And I think about, how am I seeing it differently? How am I experiencing it, perhaps via even touch? Where I live in Maine, the water is actually much warmer than it used to be. So I can swim for a much longer time in the summer than I used to be able to. Maybe you're experiencing climate change via your smell or other hearing. Look for a narrative in your story and ask follow-up questions to one another. We're going to give you 10 minutes. So plan your time together, roughly 5 minutes for one and 5 minutes for the other. Or maybe you do like 2 minutes and then 2 minutes and 2 minutes and 2 minutes. But there's no, like, you're not going to get anything wrong. There's no test. So please don't worry. And I want to also encourage you to not shy away from stories that you may feel are not significant. Maybe you, like me, don't live in an area where there are more spectacular or more kind of iconic examples of climate change, whether that may be extreme storms, wildfires, glacial melt. Maybe you're feeling it in more subtle ways. But those stories are important too. And we want to hear from you, no matter how big or small you feel your climate story may be. So now I'm going to ask Molly to put you into breakout groups of 2. We'll have you there, as I said, for about 10 minutes, and then we'll bring you back, asking you to share out 3 words that describe your conversation. So use this as a time to start thinking about what your climate story may be and interacting with a partner to really get yourself thinking and talking. Have fun, and we'll see you in roughly 10 minutes.
Welcome back to the main room. I hope you all had productive climate conversations. In this part of the workshop, we're going to use Zoom's whiteboard function to create a mind map with a prompt about the activity that you just did. So simply, it's in 3 words, describe the climate conversation that you just had. And feel free to elaborate because we have a few minutes. And Connor is going to write your responses down on the whiteboard. And again, feel free to just unmute yourself and speak, or you can contribute in the chat if you like, and I'll read your response aloud.
Could we hear from breakout room number 1? Just 3 words that the 2 of you think together might describe your conversation.
Brian, I think that's us. And one of the words that came to mind for me was fire. And another was something Brian said, which was vulnerability.
Yeah, and I think Barbara and I both sort of were able to describe very immediate effects. You know, there was a kind of immediacy to the things we were observing. It didn't feel remote or in another place.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those contributions. I'm reading a message from Kelly in the chat that says scale, weird, too much / too little. Kelly, I don't know whether you want to elaborate on those really interesting word choices.
Yeah, so we just spoke a little bit about, you know, the scale of the crisis, and weird was something that I mentioned. It's, you know, everything, it seems so weird right now as to, I mean, compared to how it usually is. And then the too much, too little, we were talking a bit about, you know, drought and having too much water. So yeah.
Thank you.
Katrin, would you be willing to share next? You and I don't know who was in your breakout group.
Yeah, I was actually with Kelly. So in terms of like too much or too little, we talked about the idea of drought and water. So I put down kind of drought, water, and smoke as kind of very distinct sort of things, and then place and experience. I think we both sort of compared how we experienced being in different places throughout the last, I don't know, 10 years maybe.
I'm also seeing a message from Christopher in the chat that says nowhere is safe.
Yeah, I was in Catherine's group, or I was paired with Catherine, and she's in Toronto, and I'm in New Orleans / Southern Mississippi, and we were commenting on, you know, how it's changing our locations. But then when we look around the country and around the continent and the world, you know, there's nowhere that you can look that's immune or, you know, resistant to climate change. Some places might be more vulnerable than others, but you know, really wherever you are, you can detect some of these changes.
Yeah, thank you. Nate writes disorientation, climate anxiety, sensing place. Nate, if you want to add to that and unmute, feel free, or not.
Oh, just one short thing. Disorientation, climate anxiety, I think they can almost in some ways speak for themselves, but with the sensing place bit, we were talking about how we feel as relative newcomers to places, moving around as academics and not staying in a place for too long, especially, you know, in my case, like as, you know, a scholar in training, and the challenges that kind of places upon us as trying to understand a place. And so we do a lot of work of interviewing our neighbors and our friends who have lived in these places for 20 or 30 years. And we're like, what has the climate been like? Are we experiencing something that is even close to what might be considered normal? And so that was just some of the work that we both have done just within our communities to try to understand. I was with Saskia just to try to understand what is happening and how we fit into that, because it is an extremely disorienting process right now to try to understand connection to place when you move to a new place.
Thank you so much, Nate, for elaborating on that. The technique of climate interviewing that we had you do here is actually at the basis of a workshop we've piloted twice with 6th graders who, much like academics, don't have a long experience of place. And the interviewing process that we have them do, we're finalizing that workshop now, is to practice interviewing their teacher and then taking those interview techniques home and interviewing elders in their community, and then coming back in and sharing and working on those stories in the classroom together. So just a sense of, you know, where we are in some of the other workshops. It's really remarkable to hear both the particularities of your climate conversations as well as the themes that are threaded through, I think, all of the conversations that we heard. Catherine is sharing in the chat, borderlessness and the porousness. I think these are experiences that many people can share. I hope that your conversations were generative also for you thinking about really the specialness and specificness of your own story. We're gonna ask you now to go it alone without a partner. And we've provided a Google form, which you can use to draft a story. We have an official contribute a story page in the story bank that you could use later should you feel that you wanted to develop your story, flesh it out, add any visual materials you may or may not want to include there. But we didn't want you to feel any pressure that you had to have finished this in 10 minutes and make it seem good. Many people do after 10 minutes say, you know, I feel like I really want to put this in the story bank. And the story bank, as you saw, is a growing repository with some light metadata. Our hope is that as the project grows and more stories are included in the story bank, that it really will provide a very helpful resource for educators of all ages and places to look at climate stories, both according to geography as well as according to the metadata categories that we've identified. In the contribute form that we offer through the story bank, you can also suggest new metadata fields. But for now, we have a Google form for you. Connor and Tsemone have both dropped the URL in the chat. And we're going to ask you to take about 10 minutes reflecting on your climate conversation and fill out the prompts, the sort of answers to some questions we have, which are designed really to guide you toward crafting a climate story. In 10 minutes, we're going to come back and again have a mind mapping session. So take your time, and to keep you company, Molly is also going to play a Spotify playlist that Tsemone started and many workshop participants have contributed to, called Playlist for the Climate Crisis. So no breakout rooms, just open the Google form, and in about 10 minutes, we'll bring you back, bring your attention back to the workshop and the group session. Thanks, Molly. Welcome back. Take a moment to clear your head slightly and come back into this shared space. And really looking forward to hearing about how the writing is going. Over to you, Tsemone.
First of all, I just want to make sure that everyone can see the whiteboard that I'm sharing right now. Okay, good. So in this part of the workshop, we'd like to hear what you wrote, if you feel comfortable sharing what your climate story was or what you drafted, and also what did it feel like to write a climate story? What are your reflections on the experience as well? I'll try and paste those questions on the whiteboard. Again, feel free to either unmute yourself or respond in the chat, and Connor will write down your responses on the whiteboard.
I wonder if we might start by asking for locations. Where is your story set?
I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and as Nate was sharing, I'm a relative newcomer here. Maybe for that reason, and maybe this is something that you gesture towards Bethany. Like I felt a little bit of imposter syndrome kind of in writing my climate story. Like, do I have the right to tell this story? And part of it was thinking about, yeah, I had a surprising amount of self-doubt. Like, is this actually a climate story or is this a weather story? How accurate are the accounts of prior weather patterns that I've been receiving? How different is this really? And a lot of my work is really driven by climate change at a more abstract level. So it was interesting to me to have those feelings come up when I was writing a more personal story.
I think that's remarkably insightful, Saskia. Thank you so much for sharing that. I have experienced much of that similar kind of self-doubt, where when I think about, well, what is this really climate or is this weather? Is this my story to tell? You know, those are, I think it's very interesting when we bring these global issues down to the personal, almost embodied individual scale, it becomes a different experience. I see Lara has a hand up.
Hi everyone. I'm based in Philadelphia, but the location I wrote about is my home country or my home city. It's Makati City in the Philippines, where all of my family is still based. It's Makati, Makati. I guess the feelings I had was about, like, you know, being the one person in my family living in the global north and having to like witness climate change when I go home to visit my family. And in a way, my family doesn't seem as concerned as I am. You know, for them, it's just like when I go there, and I've felt like how we've lost the cool days during like what we would call the Burr months, you know, like November and December. It's no longer cool when I visit them. And for them, it's just like, now it's hot during Christmas, you know. But for me, I think about like I'm thinking about the climate crisis when I feel like this hot weather, and I'm just struggling with, like, I guess part of the thing, sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. Like, I'm just worried about my niece and nephews who are 5 to 13, and I keep thinking about how they will be especially affected. Like, I don't care too much about myself anymore. I'm really thinking about how this is going to affect them.
Thank you so much for sharing, Laura. I think it's something we often come across or have to hold space for in our workshops. I think Bethany and Connor will agree that this does bring up really hard emotions sometimes. So thank you for deciding to be vulnerable.
I think sitting with those feelings can be very hard. You can see, Laura, I share your sense. It's very hard, but it's very important to do. We're seeing Brian in the chat. Brian, would you like to unmute and share your story?
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, this is kind of a half-baked idea that came out of, you know, some of the things. I've taught classes on like climate storytelling, and they've observed that when I ask my students to think about this question of how climate change affects them, you know, they don't have the historical memory or the experience to be able to properly attribute things they're observing to climate, you know, and sort of long-term patterns. And so, you know, I wonder if it's focusing on that question of the weather versus the climate is in some ways, it immobilizes them, right? Because all they can really talk about is what they're experiencing on the day-to-day or how they experience things. And, you know, and so I connect this to, you know, there are even some climate scientists are, you know, saying that too much focus on attribution science has been weaponized by denialists. Like we get it. It's climate change, right? It's happening. And to dwell on that, on that question too hard is in some ways to deny the experiences that you're actually having. So again, I don't know what argument I'm making here, only that, it seems, as I said in my comment, focusing on things that they're experiencing, the extremity of weather, of the scale of things, their feelings of vulnerability, and focusing more on the things that they're experiencing directly. I'm not sure if that's helpful.
I think that's super helpful, Brian. Thank you so much for sharing that. And as I mentioned before, precisely for this reason of wanting to increase climate literacy by asking that question and asking people to think with, is it climate or is it weather? We have developed this interviewing technique so that younger climate observers or experiencers can interview older folks. And really trying to, not to also recognize that a climate story is filled with uncertainty, and that it isn't, it's not, always so clear, but this larger experience of uncertainty and anxiety is also a large part of what many people's climate stories involve. I'm going to ask you now to zoom out slightly in the last 2 minutes that we have together, to think now with a more analytical hat on. It might be a welcome break from some heavy emotional labor. And just to kind of reflect on, this is My Climate Story Workshop 101. This is a workshop that we imagine could be used in a college classroom and has been used and piloted in college classrooms and in settings for older people. And I'm just we would really like to hear both answers to 2 questions, and just quickly unmute and rapid fire. Let us know, what 3 things did you learn in this workshop? Maybe about yourself, maybe about climate storytelling, maybe about the personal and what its relationship is to global climate change. And we'd also like to hear how you might use what you learned today beyond this workshop. And in that second question is housed a request for suggestions from you to us about how we can tailor materials going forward that you might find useful. So there's no real protocol. We'd love to have you just raise your hand if you would like, or simply unmute and jump in. Connor is standing by to collect responses. Catherine?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, it's really interesting to me to hear about your method. I run a small platform out of the University of Guelph where I direct the creative writing MFA called Imagining Climates. And we also have a climate storytelling project that's concentrated on microclimate stories, so keeping them super short and super specific. But what I love about your 4-part process, moving from place and then moving into sense, which I think is so crucial in terms of accessing the experiential before you start to think about how the change made you feel or how to reflect on it. And I just think it's so grounding but important to be returned to the senses. And I think that's also a way potentially of moving us away from the immediately apocalyptic and just rooting us in a place and in our experience and our micro experience, but again, that can connect us to others and what others are feeling and experiencing, which feels so essential to this process. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Catherine, for that really rich comment. That attention to the sensory and sense elements was really our kind of emphasis to say that we usually sense climate through, a ocean, sort of thermometers, or sea level rise monitors, but that human senses are also registering much valuable climate change information. So we wanted to collect those here. We are unfortunately up on time. I'd like to thank everyone for your participation, for your comments. We would have, of course, loved to hear from you. Please do write to us at director@ppehlab.com. We'll just drop, if you would like to contribute to the story bank, which of course we hope you would. I'm just going to drop the formal the URL for how to do that into the chat, and we will send you on your way.